Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Cambridge Forum discussing the Iron Cage with Rhashid Khalidi of the Middle East Studies Institute of Columbia University. I'm Anthony Lewis, a former op-ed columnist for the New York Times. As seemingly endless violence plays out between Israelis and Palestinians, and there's a lot more violence in the region, not only the violence between Israelis and Palestinians these days, in the Middle East there's a wide range of terrible violence. We Americans are left asking whether there will ever be a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In his new book, The Iron Cage, Rhashid Khalidi uses history to provide a clear-eyed view of the region and assess the prospects for peace. What are the challenges that face Palestinian leaders? How might it be possible for Palestinians and Israelis to overcome their deep-seated antagonisms and fears? If peace is dependent on Palestinian statehood, what are the chances of achieving that goal? I've known Rhashid Khalidi and admired him from a distance for a long time. He's director of the Middle East Studies Institute at Columbia and the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies. I want to interject a personal note here. I think as much as any individual who is knowledgeable, and he's very knowledgeable about the Middle East, he strives successfully for even-handedness. I don't mean to say that he's got a scale, you have to have so much of one, so much of the other, but he's fair to both sides. And in particular, he's knowledgeable not only about Palestinian history, but about what he has called tragic Jewish history. He's written more than 80 articles and 4 previous books on aspects of Middle Eastern history and politics, including Resurrecting Empire in 2004. He's been a guest many times on television and radio, and his work has been recognized with grants from the MacArthur, Rockefeller, and Ford Foundations, among others. I think now my job is simply to get out of the way and welcome Professor Khalidi.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very, very much, Tony. It's an honor to be introduced by someone whom I've always admired, whose writing I grew up reading in the New York Times. Thank you all very, very much for coming. You could have been watching playoff games. I know you're not watching because the Red Sox are not in the playoffs. I'm sorry about that, but I'm only hoping the Yankees will lose anyway, and we'll all be happy, at least those of us who are Yankee haters. Thank you for coming. I know that you're all here because you sense that the issue of Palestine and the topics that I touch upon in this book, which I hope you'll buy and read, are important to this country and important to many of us in other ways as well. And I will talk for, I'm told, 15 minutes is what I'm asked to talk for, and then I'll be happy to answer questions about the book and other things. This is a book that I wrote over quite a period of time. It grew out of a book I finished in the early 90s when I was living largely in Jerusalem and was involved in an early round of Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations. And I finished that book with a sense that there might be a possibility of a Palestinian state being established, and with the question, why had it not been established before? And that was the question that germinated in my mind, and over a period of 10 years, with a detour to write Resurrecting Empire, ultimately led to this book. What this book does is to examine the failure of the Palestinians to establish an independent state or even the structures of state before 1948, which was the year of the founding of the State of Israel and the year of the dissolution of Arab Palestine, as well as the impact of that failure on the Palestinians and others in the years that followed 1948. Now, when I started thinking about this topic, a bunch of other questions came into my mind, and I think they informed, in some measure, the way I thought about the themes of this book and the way I wrote this book. These are questions that that relate to the present as much as they relate to the past. Questions like, what is the point, what is the purpose that is served by a study like this when almost 6 decades after 1948, an independent Palestinian state in any real sense of the word independent doesn't exist, and when its establishment continues to face formidable obstacles? I think it's as unlikely to appear today as at any time in the past 60 years. And that was one of the questions I felt I had to ask myself, and I try and answer in this book. Now, it's important, I think, to stress that this is not a history of Palestine. It's not a history of Palestine and Israel. It's not a history of the conflict. It's an attempt to address one component in that conflict, the Palestinian component, and one sub-issue relating to the Palestinians, specifically the failed effort thus far of the Palestinians to achieve independence in their own homeland. I focus largely on the mandate period before 1948, but I have 2 long chapters in which I bring the story up to date. And I think that it's clear from what happened this summer in both Gaza, much less reported, and Lebanon, which we all paid attention to, I think. It's clear from what happened how intimately the effort of the Palestinians, failed though it has been, to achieve independence is intertwined with regional and international factors. This is no longer just a Palestinian-Israeli matter. This is a matter that affects the entire region, in some ways affects the entire world. And I think it illustrates the crucial importance of a careful reading or rereading of recent Palestinian history to attain an understanding of the overall conflict. And I think that that is one of the things that has been underdone. We've had a great deal of attention to aspects of the conflict. We've had a great deal, too much attention, in fact, to some. There's an enormous amount of attention, for example, to Israel and to Israel's history. There's been a huge amount of attention to the international politics of it. I don't think there's been enough attention to Palestinian history itself. And I think that the one-dimensional and largely ahistorical approach to the conflict in the media, in public discourse in our country, and in particular, the approach to the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict generally and the Palestinians in particular, through the prism of terrorism that's prevalent in our country, obscures thoroughly all of the specificities involved, whether the specificities of Palestinian history or of Israeli or Lebanese or other histories. Obviously, the Palestinian attempt failed thus far, I repeat, to achieve independence is only one of the elements that has to be grasped in order to understand the causes of conflict in the Middle East. But I think that because this Palestinian quest for nearly a century has been so central to events in the Middle East, willfully ignoring it leads us directly, non-stop, to the kind of reductive, partial, and misguided official thinking in our country that I think has played a big part in producing the very serious problems that affect the Middle East. I would say the same thing is true of much of the official view of the rest of this region. Now today, if you read the headlines, it appears that the Palestinian Authority that was established in 1995 in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is tottering. It may be on the point of collapsing following the election of Hamas in January and following the boycott imposed on the Palestinian territories, the occupied territories, by the United States, by the EU, and by Israel. The state that the Palestinians never had, the state that many people expected to emerge from the Palestinian Authority, obviously seems at least as far away as ever. I think that this is a good time, in other words, to ask the question of why was it that the Palestinians failed in all of their efforts before 1948, and why was it? What was the impact of that failure down to the present? In other words, to what extent does this history illuminate present failures? Now, some people, in particular Palestinians, were very critical of the approach that I took. Some of them said, why do you describe this as a Palestinian failure? Specifically, why do you focus on the role of the Palestinians in their past defeats when they were clearly the weakest of all the parties engaged in the struggle to determine the fate of Palestine that ended with the establishment of Israel in 1948? I don't need to list what those parties were. Great Britain, which was the greatest imperial power of its day, the United States, the Soviet Union, both of which voted for partition and supported the establishment of Israel, a number of other powers, the Zionist movement itself, later on the State of Israel, and finally, and very equivocally, the various Arab states. All of these actors, without exception, had more ability to influence outcomes, was more powerful, was better organized than were the Palestinians themselves. Now, to rephrase the question I just asked, why ask this question in light of these facts? Some of these people argue, why concentrate on the failures or incapacities of the Palestinians to achieve independence before 1948, or for that matter, since 1948, when the forces arrayed against them are so powerful and have overwhelmed them at every turn? Why don't you focus on these external forces? And in some measure, I do in this book. What I do not do, what I try not to do, is to argue that the Palestinians should bear all the responsibility for every outcome. I certainly don't go as far as those who would blame the victims for their victimization and say they bear all of the responsibility. In light of my view, which is that a variety of actors, international actors and others, bear a heavy responsibility for what has happened, I think that the benefits of blaming the victims, thereby absolving everyone else of responsibility, should be clear. I argue that there are things, however, that have to be looked at in Palestinian performance, in choices that the Palestinians took. I would argue that most choices the Palestinians have faced at most phases of their history have been bad choices. But there were choices. Bad, worse, worst. Those are still choices. And those are generally the kinds of choices the Palestinians have often had. And what I'm trying to do in saying this is to do something that I think a lot of Palestinian histories or Palestinian narratives of Palestinian history don't do, which is to give the Palestinians agency, to put them at the center of their own narrative, to look at their history in terms of their history rather than in terms of some external set of circumstances, and to try and see where they were responsible, where they were not, where we can't assess the answer to that question. Whether external forces or internal Palestinian weaknesses or some combination of the two have, whether it's this or that or some combination that has prevented the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, I am still left with another question. And I think this is a question we should ponder. Is statehood the destined outcome for a people who, since the early part of the 20th century, have had a clearly defined national identity, but who have been unable to develop lasting, viable, structural forms for this identity, or to control a national territory in which it can be exercised? This is a question that can be asked about the Kurds as well. This is a question that can be asked about a number of peoples in this region, in the Middle East, as well. But it's certainly a question that could be asked about the Palestinians. And there are questions that follow from that, or should follow from that, about what do you have when the answer is no, that these people are not likely to have a state. What do they have? And moreover, what follows from that? I think all of these questions are important for at least three reasons, and I'm going to sum up in a minute. The first reason is because I think we have to understand Palestinian history and all of the things that brought us to where we are today if we are to understand where we are today. Obviously, I'm a historian. Obviously, I have a bias. I'm not simply trying to sell product. This is my methodology. This is my approach to understanding the present. I think it's the only correct approach to understanding the present. In the West, I would argue, to a very large degree, this history is a hidden history. And it's hidden for a very simple reason, and a very understandable reason. It's hidden because it is obscured by another riveting and tragic narrative, which is the narrative of modern Jewish history. In a sense, with whose history, the history of the Jewish people, the Palestinians have been entwined for this century at least. In a sense, the history of the Palestinians has disappeared in some parts of the world, certainly, under the powerful impact of the painful story of the catastrophic fate, in particular, of the Jews of Europe, but also the tragic fate of Jews in the Arab countries and in the Islamic world. In recent years, people in many parts of the world have been able to, as it were, see both of these things as related but separate. But to a certain extent, I think it is necessary still to separate, tease out Palestinian history from this other tragic history. Because I think any understanding of this region's complexities, requires comprehending Palestinian history in particular in its own terms, which includes but cannot be subsumed by Jewish or Israeli or Arab or any other important historical narrative. That's the first reason. The second is that I think it's really important to ascribe agency to the Palestinians. I think it's really important to avoid seeing them either as no more than helpless victims of forces greater than themselves, or alternatively solely being driven by self-destructive tendencies and uncontrollable internal divisions. Obviously, the Palestinians have been deeply divided for most of their modern history. Obviously, they faced an uphill struggle. They still face an uphill struggle, in some ways a worse situation today than in most periods of the 20th century. Their politics were and are divided and faction-ridden, and that gave hostile forces many cleavages to exploit. But I try and argue in this book, notwithstanding the truth of all of what I've just said, the Palestinians had a number of assets. The Palestinians were far from helpless. The Palestinians often, as I've already said, faced a range of choices, some of which were better or at least less bad than others. And I could talk, if you are interested during questions, about the 1920s, about the 1930s, about the 1990s, which are all times when I think the Palestinians maybe had more options than people have seen. I would suggest that seeing these things makes it possible to put the Palestinians at the center of a critical phase of their own story and to understand some of their present dilemmas. The final reason, the third reason I think this is important, is because I think the case of the Palestinians illustrates maybe better than any other Middle Eastern example the long-term perils and pitfalls of great powers following policies that are not based on their own professed principles and are not consonant with international law. I argue that this was true during the many decades that Britain dominated the Middle East, and I would argue that it's been true of the half-century during which we have dominated the Middle East, from the beginning of the Cold War, really, right down to the present. I could go into this in more detail, but I'm not going to. The last thing I want to say, and I won't go into this again either, in order to save time for your questions, is to say that this may look like revisionist history. It certainly is an attempt to deal with some of the issues I talk about in a fresh way. But I don't think it really is the revisionist history in the sense that, there have been revisionist histories of the Cold War, in my view, not very good ones, or there have been revisionist histories trying to rewrite the history of Israel. I would argue, and I argue in the book, that real revisionist history requires as a foil an established authoritative master narrative that's fundamentally flawed. And almost always this is a master narrative produced by a state. So I could explain how I think the Israeli, or for that matter the Cold War, revisionist histories fit that pattern. By contrast, interestingly, there is actually no established authoritative Palestinian master narrative, partly because there's no Palestinian state, although of course there is a Palestinian nationalist narrative that includes its share of myth. I would add that that nationalist narrative is almost unknown in the United States. A caricature, a ludicrous, unrecognizable, debased caricature of that narrative is occasionally trotted out to be knocked down. But most people in this country don't have any idea of how the Palestinians see their own history and the specific myths that the Palestinians tend to believe. Among these myths that I think are worth debunking, and I touch on in some cases in this book, in the Palestinian view of things, are ideas relating to the Zionist movement, ideas relating to the way in which the Zionist movement was connected historically, especially before 1948, to the Western powers, the way in which Zionism relates to the rest of modern Jewish history, and in particular, a failure to appreciate the central place of the Holocaust in modern Jewish history and in Palestinian history. The Holocaust is a European event which has a Middle Eastern sequel or consequence, both for Jews and for non-Jews. It's part of Palestinian history, as well as, of course, being a central thing, a central element in European history and in world history and international law, and, of course, in Jewish history. Another failure on the part of the Palestinians, in my view, is a reductionist view of Zionism as no more than a colonial enterprise. Now, if you look at the way in which Zionism historically has related to the indigenous Arab population of Palestine, it could be argued that that enterprise was, and in some respects still is, essentially colonial. What many Palestinians fail to understand is that Zionism also served as the national movement of a nascent polity, which is now a nation state, which, of course, was being constructed at their expense, but was nevertheless a national reality, and is a national reality. There is actually no reason why both views cannot be true. There are multiple examples of national movements and of nations, of states, that were colonial in their origins. I mean, you live in a colonial town, for heaven's sakes. The 13 colonies. This is a nation state. We are a nation with a national understanding of ourselves. The two are obviously not incompatible. And I would suggest that there's a failure of imagination on the part of many Palestinians and in the Palestinian national narrative as far as this issue is concerned. So, in this book, I try and speak to why the Palestinians were not more successful in their quest for independence before 1948 and afterwards. I argue that there were crucial periods when, in my view, the wrong road was taken or a different road might have been taken. I suggest that that's true, in fact, for periods as recent as the 1990s. I'm very critical of the entire Oslo period, and the last chapter of the book examines that. I think that in the past, many people have written on this subject and given us answers that are too glib, too easy, and in fact unfair to many of the actors involved. I think it's very hard to explain why things didn't happen. I think it's much harder when much of the evidence that explains these events has been scattered by these very events themselves. I do think, however, that some explanations can be offered, and that they will illuminate not just the history of the Palestinians before 1948, but also much of what has happened to them and others since then. I do not think these are academic matters or minor matters or arcane matters or things that really don't matter. I think they're essential to understanding whether or not the Palestinians can today create effective structures of state in the face of what I would argue is quite significant opposition. I think that the answer to this question will help us to determine whether the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip and other areas where Palestinians live will continue to live as they do today in a state of almost total instability and extreme distress. And if that can be changed, whether they and their neighbors, both Arab and Israelis, will hopefully at some stage be able to enjoy peace and stability after many decades of conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Khalidi. You've spoken candidly, and your book is admirably candid about what you call the failures of Palestinians and Palestinian society over many decades, and the responsibility, which is not to be farmed out to everybody else, but includes Palestinian responsibility. At the moment, as you've just said, we're seeing the divisions of Palestinians at their worst, with factions shooting at each other and killing each other. Is there any realistic chance of a unified Palestinian society emerging, or does it require what the Palestinians have never had? I don't think so anyway, you may correct me. A figure like Nelson Mandela, who can rise above factionalism and give people a sense of greatness in their society.
It's a good question, Tony. Let me start by saying that I do not think that the Palestinians throughout their modern history have been, shall we say, blessed in their leaders. They've been very unfortunate in their leadership, down to the present, virtually all of them included. But I would just dispute one aspect of your question. One of the interesting things about the Palestinians is that the society itself is actually not terribly divided. The political culture is divided. And what they lack is not a unified society, but unified structures of state. The only reason there are still people in this world today who call themselves Palestinians is because of the resilience of that society. It is not thanks to the very, in my view, very, very, very insufficient efforts of those who have made themselves their leaders. It is not due to the largely inefficient structures of state that they have created over the past several decades. It is rather due to the inherent strength of Palestinian society, that the kind of pressures that I talk about in this book have not rent it completely, have not shattered these people, and have not created people who no longer share an identity, which they very clearly still do. So I don't think the issue is Palestinian society, but I think you are right in the part of the question. Will the Palestinians ever manage to get together politically and produce unified structures of state? And that's the question I ask in the book, and I don't know the answer. I will say one thing. If you want to know the answer of one of the closest observers of what is going on today, read Amira Haas's piece in today's Haaretz. This is the result, what we see today, Palestinians slaughtering one another in the streets of Gaza. It's a despicable, shameful display, tragic, is the result of what happens when you put people in a pressure cooker, seal the top, and turn the temperature higher and higher and higher and higher. This is not a natural result of, the way the Palestinians relate to one another politically. However lacking and deficient those relations have been in the past. This is a result of, in particular Gaza, this is where this is happening, is a result both of the flaws and problems with Palestinian political culture, both with the failure to develop structures of state, both with the failures of leadership and the extraordinary pressures that our government, the governments of the EU and the government of the State of Israel have put on the most vulnerable and the weakest and the poorest of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, which I will remind you has the highest density per capita of any place on earth. So it's happening in the most difficult environment. I don't know the answer to the question. I mean, to the extent to which I can answer it, I've tried to answer it in the book. But I think you've put your finger on the key question.
You may say you don't know the answer, but I thought you gave a very good answer, making us think. Today's New York Times had an ad, a very interesting ad, with many, many distinguished signers, former foreign secretaries of Britain, key American figures from around the world. The headline is "Toward a Comprehensive Settlement of the Arab-Israeli Conflict," and it calls on the international community to step forward and insist on negotiations, concrete steps toward decreasing the pressure cooker, among other things that you just spoke of, though it didn't use that phrase. Now, that really may come down, I'm talking too long, but it seems to me that really comes down to us, the United States. What's the chance of our doing what this ad wants us to do?
I think this ad probably would have a better response anywhere in the world, including Israel, than I'm afraid it will have from our government. I'm sad to say, I think that the people who seem to understand this, get this the least, are the people who we elected or selected or somehow got themselves into office in 2000 and 2004. And this administration in particular. I mean, anybody who's read anything I've written ever before knows that I've not gone down on record as a great fan of any previous administration, the Clinton administration and the first Bush administration included. Nevertheless, I think that this administration has reached a low in many, many regards insofar as treatment of this question is concerned. And I'm sad to say that I don't really think that they are going to pick up on this ad. I only wish they would. I only wish they and others who have it in their power to act, which don't just include the United States. One of the greatest abdications of responsibility has been by Europe, which shares a major portion of the responsibility for the creation of this mess, Britain in particular, but Europe as a whole, and which has done almost nothing to resolve it. There are many others who the Arab countries bear a huge share. I talk in the book about the Palestinians. So, to abbreviate my answer, I wish that there would be a response from our government. I think this is a vital national interest. I think that if the United States has any vital national interests in the Middle East, this should be one of them. That anybody inside the Beltway will see this, I doubt. Shall I stay here? Is that the idea now? Okay.
Okay, I'm going to stop talking soon, but I'll ask one more question, which really is a follow-up or a preview of the previous question. Anybody who reads your book will be fascinated, but should not expect a rose garden. As your remarks tonight have indicated, you're a very realistic person. You speak here of a letter President Bush wrote in 2004, in which he spoke of Israeli settlements, including the largest and the ones that essentially cut the West Bank into cantons, as realities on the ground.
Right.
And you say, even if the ghost of Orwell rises and walks again, and American and Israeli leaders in future choose to call this patchwork of open-air prison camps a state, the possibility of a real Palestinian state may well have disappeared with President Bush's April 2004 letter to Ariel Sharon. Are you really that gloomy?
Yep. I really am that gloomy. I think that might have been the last nail in the coffin. I mean, I quote somewhere near that passage you quote something said by Tony Judd, which is that anything any politician has done can be reversed by another politician. So in principle, anything is reversible. But I'm not entirely sure that if the course that things are on don't change, I am that pessimistic, yes. But it could be changed.
And specifically, I mean, here maybe it's getting too specific, but can you envisage the kind of rollback of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank that would permit a viable single unity in the West Bank instead of what you call cantons, cut up by roadways and settlements?
It's hard to envisage it now, but things that seemed unenvisageable are now realities. It was hard to envisage. It was extremely hard for the people who were dealing with us in Washington on behalf of the U.S. State Department to believe that Israel would recognize the PLO. They did. It was hard to believe that Israel would withdraw as it did from South Lebanon in 2000. They did. Things change in Israel. Israeli body politic shifts in its views of something, and things could change. Unfortunately, I don't see the impetus coming from anywhere else but inside the Israeli body politic, and unfortunately, I don't see that trend there currently. But yes, that could change. The support for the settlers, in my view, is not very deep, and the view of most Israeli observers is not very deep. It could change. There are many reasons why it's not changing now, but I think, yes, it could change.
You're really saying, if I understand you, that the basis for hope lies in the nature of Israeli society more than in ours.
I mean, in the last analysis, Israelis are going to have to change their views of things if Israel is to change its policy. There are many ways that those views could be changed. I mean, it has happened in the past that the United States has changed its position, and the Israeli electorate, I'm thinking of the loan guarantee issue, I'm thinking of a couple of cases where there was a collision between U.S. policy and Israeli policy. And the Israeli body politic immediately picked up on the fact that it probably wouldn't be a good idea to go up against the United States. And they changed their views. The Israelis voted for different leaders at 2 or 3 phases of the last 20 or 30 years. So I think it's possible. Part of the problem is that a lot of cement has been poured around people's feet in Washington. And so that venue for change is less likely than it might have been in the past. That doesn't mean that the Israelis can't change. The withdrawal of 2000 was a perfect example. That had nothing to do with the United States. That was a purely Israeli decision.
Now I think we should go to the audience. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you're not shy or you wouldn't be here. Please come forward. Line up at the microphone.
Yes, sir. Sure, I can do it. No, I can do it. I mean, they'll be in line.
I would like to take you at your word and not be in the Arab-Israeli conflict for a second, but to try to tease things out.
Okay.
And go back to the early period of 1912 to 1920, when the beginnings of Palestinian nationalism was occurring simultaneously with Jewish nationalism.
Right.
As I understand it, there was a short period that the Arab Higher Committee actually was developing democratic institutions, that people were voting, and that there was a real sense of community. But that process was hijacked by the Husseini family. And from that point on, there has basically been a destruction of the opportunity for the Palestinians to develop true democratic institutions.
You're right in some respects, you're wrong in some respects. The last time that the Palestinians had, all of the Palestinians had the opportunity to participate in the democratic process was under the Ottoman Empire, before 1918, when there were elections to parliament and people were elected from various parts of Palestine. The British, as I try and show in the book, systematically subverted the possibility of elections. Now, part of your question is right. One of the things that the Mufti, Haj Amin, did was to sabotage where he could such attempts as there were to carry out some form of grassroots democracy. But these would have had to have taken place within either the framework of the state, i.e. nationwide elections to a parliament, which the British prevented, or municipal elections, which ultimately did take place, and in which you had various interesting results. Or, if the British prevented it on a national level, which they did from the beginning of the mandate to the end, in the context of some national institutions. This is what happened in India with the Congress Party. So a democratic tradition developed both in some provincial governments where the British allowed those elections, but also within the Congress Party. And what the Palestinians lacked, in my view, and I argue this in the book, was either of those two things, either the ability to develop some forms of democracy through the institutions of state, prevented by the British, or the ability to do this on their own in parallel institutions that challenged the legitimacy of the state, which the Egyptians did, which the Indians did. The Palestinians didn't do that. And I mean, I think we over-demonize Haj Amin. He's easy to demonize. And I'm not very friendly to him in this book. But I don't think it was entirely his fault. I think the entire notable leadership was perfectly happy in some respects to be the unelected representatives of the Palestinians, not realizing that gave them a much weaker standing than the elected democratic leadership of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine, which had institutions that the British encouraged, fostered, and allowed them to develop unmolested. Yes, sir.
This may be a naive question, but I'm trying to clarify something you're saying. You talk about a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
And now, I'm familiar with some of the history, and that in 1948 the Arabs chose to attack Israel instead of doing whatever they were given, and then the West Bank was controlled by Jordan, and Egypt controlled Gaza, and then Yasser Arafat came along, and he wasn't interested in making the West Bank into a state. He was after Israel. So here we are today, and you say we can't form a state. I'm getting the impression that there's something I'm missing by what you mean by state. You seem to have a specific idea of what the state should look like, or are you just talking about state in general?
I'm talking about state in general.
Then why don't they just declare a state? I mean,
They've done it twice.
Yeah. So what's?
They don't have real structures of state. I mean, the potted history that you started with. Yeah. I hope you'll be able to read the book, because I think you'll see that the history is a lot more complex than that. But what I'm talking about is developing the structures of state that national movements generally, successfully or not so successfully, try and develop, either by taking over a colonial state, which is what happened in most of the Arab countries, or developing structures of state, which in the case of the issue of the Zionist movement did, and in other countries where the colonial power wouldn't let them take over the colonial state was also done. India was an example of that. And the Palestinians were unsuccessful in doing either of these things during the mandate. Since then, the PLO operated in some respects as a parastate. But some of the basic things that a state has to have, a rule of law, some kind of a successful state should have, in my view, rule of law, democratic structures of governance, and so on and so forth, the PLO never really developed. And so this is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the territory within which a state exercises its power. That's not what I'm really addressing when I talk about this issue.
You're talking about the structure.
Yeah.
It's not there. Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to take my jacket off, if you don't mind the informality. Really hot in here. Last day of summer, folks. Enjoy it.
In the years that I've been following this and listening to all the periodic negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians over the decades, it always seems like the subject of discussion is how much oppression the Palestinians will accept, how much land they will give up. Always Palestinians as the junior partner under Israel's thumb. Why not change the subject of discussion to equal rights within Israel? Here, Israel is a Jewish supremacist state. Why should that be acceptable to anyone? Why is that acceptable? Why is that any more acceptable than a white supremacist state as South Africa or an Aryan supremacist state? Why does the Palestinian leadership, you included, why do you let that slide? And if you turn the conversation to that subject, that would have a resonance in America, because we would remember our own history, our own civil rights struggle. Why not draw the parallel? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I don't consider myself a part of the Palestinian leadership. I'm very flattered that you do. And secondly, I will just give you what I think is a factual answer to your question. One of the problems with that approach is that, however diluted some people may think them to be, both a majority of Palestinians and a majority of Israelis at this moment in time seem to believe that they want to have a state of their own. Most of them seem to want to have those states side by side. Now, I argue in the book that that outcome may no longer be possible for reasons that have nothing to do with my preferences or their preferences, but what may be realities that are supervening. Some of what you say does point to some glaring injustices. It is almost always the case, the Palestinians being the weaker party, that they are being imposed upon. It is almost always the case that certain things are never examined. The inequality of rights within Israel, the fact that Israel, for two-thirds of its existence, has ruled over a Palestinian subject population in the occupied territories. The occupation is in its 40th year now. I know exactly how old Israel is because I was born in 1948. I'm going to be 58 in November. Israel will be 58 in May. 40 of those 58 years, Israel has ruled over the occupied territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It never seems to be brought into the discussion that this helot population has been completely deprived of rights for 2.5 generations. And they just sit there in limbo. And this is some of the problem, part of the problem, a problem? Not at all. It doesn't exist in American public discourse. Talking about ending the occupation, talking about equal rights are almost unimaginable ways of approaching the subject. Instead, we're told the Palestinians have to do this, the Palestinians have to do that, and so forth. One other thing you said about so many decades of negotiations, the only time that there were negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis were starting in Madrid and ending in Camp David. There really have not been any other negotiations. So there was a 9-year period in the 60-odd-year history of this struggle. There were no negotiations in the 20s or 30s or 40s for that matter.
Professor Khalidi, I'm sorry that the prospect for a viable Palestinian state is so bleak. Given that fact, however, what is your comment on the possibility and the desirability of a one-state solution, as Virginia Tilley has described in her book?
Mm-hmm. Well, I address this to some extent in the chapter of this book, in which I talk about how different people have envisaged states in Palestine. What kind of state should there be? One state, two state, an Israeli state, a Palestinian state, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I talk about is the fact that many proponents of a one-state solution don't seem to me to take into account what I said in response to the previous questioner, which is that large majorities of Israelis and Palestinians seem to want their own state. And they seem to want that very much. This is not a passing fad. This is not a small majority. These are large majorities of both peoples, including many supporters of Hamas, interestingly enough. Many of the people who actually voted for Hamas in the last elections feel this way. So that would be a first obstacle to a one-state solution. A second obstacle to a one-state solution, in my view, is that what we have now is a one-state solution. What we've had since the end of the June War is a one-state solution. In fact, in some ways, what we had since the end of the 1948 war is a one-state solution. You had a Jordanian control of the West Bank and Egyptian military occupation of the Gaza Strip. But there was one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. And certainly since 1967, there has been one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. And what I'm concerned about is that that may be the one state that we're going to get. One state with rights for its own citizens and not without rights for the Helit population that lives in whatever you want to call the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So you'd have to move a lot of people from where they are now, and you'd have to overcome the very powerful realities that have created the one-state solution that is the status quo and has been for at least 39 years and running. That would be my answer to that.
Thank you. I have two or three really closely related questions. One, when you say that the Palestinians, you want to make them more agents in their struggle, less passive and more agents?
In their story.
In their story, right. Doesn't that accidentally coincide with the Orthodox Israeli narrative, which is, in a sense, while they're interested in their own history, they make themselves the pacific reactors to the alleged Palestinian agents? The Mufti did this. The Palestinians rejected partition.
I got the point.
Yeah,
that's the first question.
Right. Two.
There's 18 people behind you.
No, but it's related because when Mr. Lewis says, "Why didn't the Palestinians produce a Mandela?" I would think more a Martin Luther King, because as you just pointed out, in '67, if the Palestinians and Arabs didn't want partition, in '67, essentially Israel abolished partition.
Yeah.
Where were the strategists? Where were the people saying, why not equal rights for all? We're in the middle of the King civil rights movement. I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
As far as the agency question, well, I mean, I address it head on in the book. I hate to keep saying, I can't answer this here, read the book. But that's, in a way, what I'm saying here. It can be argued that saying what I'm saying, and in fact, some of the people who've read it, including my brother, have said to me, well, it looks like, you sound like you're, picking up a trope from Zionist propaganda. I don't think I am. I think there's a nuanced argument there, which I don't think does say that the Palestinians are the active agents and the poor Israelis are the passive respondents to whatever. And I think you still have to do that. And I mean, when this book is translated into Arabic, I hope that will be the main argument that I'll have, because I think it's an important argument to have with people who seem to see the Palestinians as just victims on the Palestinian side. As far as the second part of the question, I just can't answer that. Why did the Palestinians have the leadership they've had in the past? I can try and answer that. Why don't they have a Mandela? I mean, as I sometimes say, the job description of a historian does not include predicting the future. I can try and help explain to you how we got to where we are, but I certainly can't tell you, where we're going or what. I can't. I don't do those things. Ma'am.
First woman, but I hope there are more back there.
I see two.
Okay, good.
You mentioned... We should do affirmative action and leapfrog them. Go ahead.
You said that in ways the answer for what happens in the future has to come from within Israeli society and shifts in that society. I am particularly troubled by the results of a recent poll, an Israeli poll, which showed that over 80% of Israeli Jews would not live in an apartment building with an Arab in it, that the majority wanted Palestinian Israelis to be expelled, is what the poll results seem to show. And I think this is especially troubling because we keep hearing about the textbooks in Palestine that teach children to hate, and yet this hate seems to be proliferating. What can be done about that?
Well, in some measure, the hate is generated by the conflict. And in some measure, the hate is generated by states and para-states. In the state, in the Israeli case, because in some measure public attitudes are going to be influenced by the attitudes of the state. I would say two things about that. Firstly, when you have a state like the State of Israel, in which one ethnicity or one religious group is described as having a specific and privileged place, there is a possibility it's going to lead to those kinds of attitudes. The second thing I would say is that I would never try and reify a poll. A poll is a reflection, relatively imperfect, at a specific time of the answers of a specific group of people to a specific number of questions. I mean, look at American elections. Look at polls in the United States. Things change. You might get a completely different set of answers 9 years hence, and you might have gotten a completely different set of answers 18 months earlier had you asked the same question. So, I mean, I'm sure those polls that the questioner cited do reflect some deep issues. Not wanting to live with people of another nationality obviously involves some issues, as does the equally, chilling idea that a number of these citizens of this country want to boot out other citizens of the same country. But I wouldn't reify those numbers. I wouldn't assume that that's an unchanging phenomenon. Look at the way Palestinian opinion has changed over the past decade or two. We have very good polling for about 15 years. And views have changed. People's views change. People's views change in the United States. A majority of Americans were not against the war in Iraq. An overwhelming majority of Americans are now against the war in Iraq and have been for almost 2 years. Most Americans didn't think the president lied. Most Americans now believe the president lied. So things change. Thank God. It's the right place to say that, actually. Yes, sir.
Mr. Khalidi, the territories and people in question consist of two parts, Gaza and West Bank. So I want to pose for you two questions. Mm-hmm. You call the Gaza a pressure cooker, but at the same time, the Gaza's Arab administration controls the border with Egypt, which is a brotherly Arab country. Why do Gazans elect to attack Israel instead of making a road to Cairo? Cairo is a center, cultural center of an Arab world, an economic center too. And for many years they were part of Egypt. I have a postage stamps which was made by Egypt. And this postage stamps says that Gaza is a part of Egypt. It's one question. And second question about what you said that about failure of Palestinians to establish a state. I think Palestinians didn't fail to establish a state. They did establish a state. And this state is Jordan.
Okay, I got
it's a viable. No, I want to continue. A viable state. And if you go to Christian Science building, you can see the map of the world where Palestine covers both parts, and even the flag of Palestine and Jordan, which is Palestine, they're the same.
Okay, thank you. The flag of Jordan and Palestine is an Arab nationalist flag, which was produced during World War I by Jam'iyya al-Arabiya al-Fatat, and it was adopted by a number of Arab countries, Kuwait, Palestine, Jordan, and others. It's not really the same flag. They derive from a similar origin. The state of Jordan is not a Palestinian state, nor was it created by the Palestinians, nor was it created to serve the Palestinians. The state of Jordan was created by Winston Churchill to serve Britain, British strategic objectives, and objectives that related to Zionism. That's the only reason it was created. Now, there are Jordanians who have now developed a Jordanian national consciousness. Jordan is a state which has a national consciousness, which includes a majority of Palestinians or people of Palestinian origin, but it is a separate, independent state, unless you think that the state of Kuwait shouldn't exist because once upon a time it was part of a larger whole. Then I don't understand why you don't think a separate, independent state of Jordan. I'm not really asking you that question. It's rhetorical. Let me go on. I'm sorry. So I think that arguing that, Jordan is Palestine, I think should be by now seen for what it is, which is a device to deny that the Palestinians have any rights in their own native country. Let me get to your first question. The Gaza Strip was never juridically part of Egypt. The Egyptians never annexed it. The Egyptians never claimed it. The Egyptians organized a military administration and said, we're administering part of Palestine. They never claimed it. I don't care what your postage stamp shows. The Gaza Strip has no exits, no egress, there's no entry or exit from the Gaza Strip without permission of Israel. The Rafah crossing, which you're talking about, which would enable Palestinians to launch themselves onto the broad highway to the great Mecca of Cairo, is controlled by the Israelis. They close it when they will. It's been closed for much of the past few months. Occasionally, after the pressure has built up and thousands of people have been there, some people have died, people have given birth, old people have gone into clinical seizure, and so on and so forth. Occasionally, the Israelis have seen fit to open it in the past several weeks. But basically, it has been shut for much of the past several weeks. So, the Palestinians don't control entry or exit to the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip...
Egyptians and Palestinians.
Pardon me?
Gazans and Egyptians control their border.
No, they
there
do
are
not.
no Israelis in between.
No.
None.
The
Zero.
Israelis are not there, but the Israelis do control the
Please
border.
repeat, Israelis are not there.
The Israelis are not there, but the Israelis do control the border. They monitor through televisions, and when they want to shut it, they shut it.
Probably Israelis
You know how they shut
control
it?
the Mexican border too.
Do you know how they shut it? By telling the international monitors who are placed there that their safety is in danger and they have to leave. When the international monitors leave, the border's closed. That's how it's been closed. Sir.
Yeah, you say you don't know where the impetus for change is going to come from except outside of Israeli society.
I didn't say the only impetus. I said that might be an impetus.
Okay, so let's talk about another impetus. There seem to be indications of. This summer, the London think tank Chatham House issued a report that said Iran's influence is rising in the region and it had replaced the United States as the most powerful influence in Iraq already. Secondly, at about the same time this summer, Hezbollah's heroic resistance against the IDF showed that Israel is not invincible for the second time. In fact, they provided a model for ending an Israeli occupation. So really, I think the question that comes to mind is, can Shia and Sunni overcome their long-standing historical divisions and mount a common resistance to vanquish their Zionist adversaries inside and outside the region?
Okay, let me start with historical rivalries between Sunnis and Shia. I think one of the great canards of Middle Eastern history has been that Sunnis and Shia have been at one another's throat since, Karbala or whatever, since the 7th or 8th century. In fact, you can look at vast swaths of Middle Eastern history and find periods during which the Sunni-Shia divide was unimportant, irrelevant, secondary, tertiary, minor, non-existent. So this is not a abiding fault line of Islam. It has been important at some periods.
Oh, I didn't say it was.
No, I know you didn't say it was. But
right.
what I'm trying to say is that Sunnis and Shia overcoming their differences is not necessarily the only way that things are going to happen or not going to happen. And one of the most striking aspects of what happened this summer is the appeal that Hezbollah was able to have for Sunnis. Showing that the sectarian divide is really not very important.
Why is that frightening?
It doesn't frighten me at all. I'm not saying it frightened. Right. I'm simply describing reality as I see it. I'm not saying I'm frightened or not frightened. And I think that let me try and get to what you didn't really ask a question. I'm not sure I can get at what you're trying to get me to say. But what you're trying to say is that Hezbollah was able to drive the Israelis out of South Lebanon before 2000. That's obviously true. Is that a model for the occupied territories? I would suggest that you should look at the differences between the occupied territories and Lebanon in terms of a number of factors that you would find in a place like Vietnam and you found in a place like Lebanon and you do not find in the occupied territories. I could go into this in detail if you're interested. The degree to which Israeli intelligence has penetrated various parts of Palestinian society, which is completely unmatched by their complete inability to penetrate Hezbollah. They really didn't know where the leadership was. It is clear that they know down to a level of militant, almost to the street squad leader, where Hamas and other militants are because they find them and they kill them. They've killed about 150 or so of them in the Gaza Strip since May, down to a very low level of leader, and they've arrested all of the open leaders. So we're talking about situations which are very, very different. And finally, you're talking about a place, Lebanon, which the Israelis had no particular intention of occupying permanently. By contrast, there are parts of the West Bank that I think many Israelis would like to keep. So and which many Israelis see as an integral part of their homeland, which is just not the case with South Lebanon. So there are a variety of differences between the two situations.
You don't think the armed resistance can succeed then?
But in Lebanon it did. The Israelis left in May 2000.
Right, but do you think it can in the occupied Palestinian territories?
I would argue that nonviolent resistance would be more likely to be successful.
That's what I'm getting.
Yeah. Well, you should have asked that question. Yes.
It seems to me that, all the questions of how much Israel should give up in order to get peace kind of founders on the one question of whether or not the Palestinians will actually recognize some form of Jewish state. And I read
or Israeli state.
Right. So I read an interview today in WorldNet Daily. It was Jerusalem correspondent Aaron Klein interviewed, I think it was the head of the El Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, who was a member of Fatah. And he said, we understand why Abbas is trying to recognize Israel. We feel we won't recognize Israel, but we understand what he has to do for tactical reasons. And there's the whole idea of the Hudna in Islamic theory, which is a temporary truce, which you agree to.
You want to bring this to a question?
Pardon me?
You want to bring this to a question?
Yes. How does everybody who wants peace resolve the question of whether or not, given the idea of the Hudna, whether or not you can trust the Arab side to recognize Israel?
Okay. Firstly, one of the great canards of our understanding of the modern Middle East is this idea of Hudna, the way in which it's been misinterpreted. I don't want to go into the intricacies of Islamic history, but the idea that Islamic states cannot make peace with non-Islamic states is arrant rubbish. It has no foundation in history. The second point I would make is that I can give you two pieces of data which, if you don't believe, you just don't believe that these people are sincere. The two pieces of data are that the PLO, at the time considered the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, did not just accept an Israeli state. In accepting the partition resolution of 1947 in the Palestinian Declaration of Independence of 1988, they accepted a Jewish state. So, to the extent to which you believe anything anybody says, that's what the PLO accepted. The other datum is whatever the leader, whoever he may have been, of Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade said to whoever the journalist you just quoted was, whatever that man may have said. It's clear from every poll I've ever seen over the past 15 years that majorities of Palestinians are perfectly willing to accept a two-state solution with Israel. Now, that may change. Those are opinions. It may be that those opinions will not be institutionally expressed. There's a powerful political party, Hamas, which just got elected, which doesn't accept those things, though some of its leaders do.
And Hezbollah.
Pardon me?
As well as Iran and Hezbollah.
Hezbollah is not a Palestinian party. Hezbollah has stated repeatedly, whatever the Palestinians decide, it's up to them. Nasrallah said that in his victory speech in Bint Jbeil in May 2000. That happens to be Iranian government policy. And it's not just Iranian government policy. Whatever Ahmadinejad says, this is policy rooted in a statement of the supreme leader, the first supreme leader, Imam Khomeini. Khomeini said it, whatever the Palestinians or the Syrians or the Lebanese accept, whether we agree with it or not, we will accept. Now, they say a lot of other things that are at odds with that. But for your information, that is both the official position of Hezbollah and that is also the official position of Iran. Now, I think you have to parse what they do and what they say. And some of the things that the Iranians say are completely, Iranian leaders, up to and including Khamenei, are at odds with that. But in any case, Hezbollah is not a Palestinian party. It's up in the last analysis to the Palestinians.
So I'm just going to ask, no, don't go away. I'm just going to tell you that we have just a few minutes left, so if you could please keep your questions short, one question to a person, and stop. We won't have any more questions after the gentleman in the violet-colored shirt, if that's the color.
Okay, I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but anyway, you tell me. Sir.
Yes. My point is, whatever we've been saying...
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. We've been at this for more than 40 years. He said, we said, the Jews said, the Arabs said, the media lies, the other lies. It doesn't get us
Give
anywhere.
us a question.
Yeah. And the thing is, what interests us as American citizens? And now the thing on the top of the shelf is terrorism. Mm-hmm. If we can talk about terrorism and forget about Palestine and Israel and the causes of terrorism, we'll be filtering to that and will awaken the American man who wants to live by the principles of our grandfathers, liberty, democracy, and all these things. Mm-hmm. Why don't we take this path? I mean, as you said now, as you're watching, you say something, everybody understands it differently because he heard it from the media, and the media keeps going that. Mm-hmm. So if we...
With your permission, I'm going to take that as a statement, okay?
Okay, why don't we use that?
Short questions, please,
okay.
ladies and gentlemen. There's no time.
I mean, I have no answer to that question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Given the the United States' view of Lebanon and the Europeans' view of Lebanon, what happened in this terrible situation. What do you think is the possibility of any changes taking place in this country as the reality now sets in with Jews in Israel that the danger, the safety that they thought they once had, they may no longer have? I think this leads into the question of they can initiate a possible peace policy if certain changes take place. If that makes...
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to take that as a statement because I just don't see a question in it. I don't know how I can address that.
Is there hope, you think, for change to pressure Israel internally and through change in our country so that Israel changes their policy and is beginning to in some way accept certain concessions?
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
I'm sorry for not.
I mean, I think we're actually moving away from an ability within American political discourse to have a really reasoned policy debate on this subject. I mean, I'm sad to say this, but I think that the recent years have seen an almost unreal discourse on Capitol Hill. Let me tell you a story. A congressman whose name will be unnamed was at an event in New York, a primary event, and was asked by a journalist friend of mine, Congressman, why did you support this resolution in the House which proclaims the PLO a terrorist organization when the PLO is headed by Abu Mazen? And the congressman said to the journalist, he's not the head of the PLO, he's the head of the PA. This is one of the co-sponsors of the resolution. And the journalist said to him, excuse me, sir, no, Mahmoud Abbas is the elected head of the PA, but he's also the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And the congressman didn't know that. I think that the degree to which our laws and our policies are being made by people who really don't know very much about the realities over there and are insulated from those realities is a real problem for us. I think that there are some serious, grave defects in public discourse in this country on this subject, and that's a problem. Now, how we get from that to having an effect on Israel is another issue. This is one reason I have so little hope for that I think this is one reason that things in Israel may change faster than they'll change as a result of anything happening from here. Okay?
Yeah. One sentence question.
Very quick questions, real questions with question marks at the end. I'm sorry. It's directed at previous questioners, not you, of course. Previous questioners.
You hold a chair at Columbia named for Edward Said, and some of the things you said had a lot of resonance for me, and having known his work, especially around the Holocaust.
Right.
Is there work that you're doing now, including in this book, where you think he would have had serious differences with you?
Yeah, maybe. Edward was not a historian. I mean, he wrote political and moral essays, which are collected in a number of books, and he was a political observer. And he was very knowledgeable about history, but he wasn't a historian. He never claimed to be. He was a literary critic and a cultural critic and a music critic and one of our most eminent academics, but in those fields. He might have had differences with me. He moved back and forth on the issue of a one-state and a two-state solution. And I quote him at length, both as supporting the two-state solution, of which he was one of the major authors, and towards the end of his life, as despairing at the possibility of a two-state solution and as arguing for a one-state solution. I don't know how he would look at that. He passed away just over 3 years ago, last month, in fact.
Yes.
And I just don't know. Things have changed beyond recognition. I mean, one of the things I won't go any further. I'm not sure. I don't know. But I will say one thing. Much of my understanding of the importance of the Holocaust to Palestinian history, I never fully understood when I heard him talk about it until I did the research for this book. And then I understood it a lot better. Ma'am.
Thank you so much for your eloquent talking. I just wanted to ask a question back to 1948 and back to the Palestinians. Do you think they really, I just don't know, do they have a national consciousness? Not a national consciousness, but were they really interested in having a state, or was it a reaction from the Zionist movement that in order for them to have some land to themselves, they were going to have to establish a state?
I mean, was there Palestinian national consciousness before 1948? Yes.
I mean in terms of establishing a state versus...
I mean, it's one of the things I was perplexed by. I mean, why was there not more focus on the part of the Palestinian political leadership on this issue of control of the state or establishing a state? And I try and give answers in the book. One of the things I think is that they sort of assumed that as happened in every other mandatory state under British or French mandatory control, sooner or later the majority would be allowed to rule, and self-determination sooner or later would be allowed. And they were the majority right up to the middle of 1948. And this was a naive assumption, perhaps. There are a lot of other naive assumptions I critique in this book. So I think that's part of it. But I don't think they ever then thought outside the box or outside the iron cage and said, well, if this is not going to happen, what do we have to do? And I see a lot of thinking outside the box, but not by people in the leadership. And I mean, I try and point in one chapter of the book to some of the people who are doing that thinking in newspapers and in various organizations.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi there. Both tonight and I think in your October 1st article in the Boston Globe, you mentioned revisionist history.
Yeah.
And in the Globe article in particular, you mentioned several historians. I think they were all Israeli historians,
right.
One of which was Tom Segev, and I don't remember the names of the others. What I'm wondering is, you seemed fairly critical, although you didn't go into any detail, and I haven't read your book, although I just bought it today. What would you suggest? Are those historians worth reading, and how would you read them critically, or how would you suggest what areas would you suggest reading critically?
Well, I mean, the first thing you should do is read the standard histories which they're revising. I mean, if you're really interested in this historiographically, you should read these historians. I think they are well worth reading. I think Avi Shleim is well worth reading. I think Tom Segev is well worth reading. I think the Benny Morris book on 1948 is well worth reading. I don't think you should read his political journalism or his political views today, because they're a world apart from his scholarship. But I think his scholarship is still worth reading. And I think that you should read it on papier. And then you should read their critics in Israel and outside, some of whom are completely irresponsible, and some of whom I think make, some good points. History is not something where if somebody writes the book and that's it. It keeps being rewritten and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten, and each era, each period has its own history. I mean, one reason the revisionist historians wrote what they wrote in the 80s and early 90s is because the archives were open. But another reason they wrote what they wrote the way they wrote it is because of what the mood was in Israel. There was a sense of confidence. There were some very important, very significant shifts which enabled them to see things or led them or affected their thinking. And then there's been a change in another direction since. There have been several changes. So, every generation has its own disease. Every era has its own history. Sometimes the same period is written and rewritten and rewritten again and again and again. And so this is not the last word on anything. I mean, if you read all four of Tom Segev's most important books, he's changed his views significantly. And the new one on 67 is I haven't read it, but I've read about it. It's not yet in English. It's a bombshell in some ways. And I think it involves a further development of the way he views some of these issues. So, that's what I would say. So I do think that the historians I mentioned are well worth reading. But critically, read everything. Read this book critically. Buy it first, but then read it critically. You've bought it.
I did. Thank you very much.
You a Yankees fan?
Yes, one of the few in the crowd, I believe.
I'm sorry to hear that.
You had said earlier in your speech, and also again with your anecdote where you are on the congressman, that you don't believe the politicians.
He wasn't my congressman. He's
right.
A New York congressman.
The point that you were trying to make was that the politicians in this country don't really understand the situation, that they don't get it, historically and just presently as well. I would just like you to maybe elaborate more on that, because I believe that the politicians, at least the major decision makers, really do understand the situation, and that their policies are very deliberate and very calculated.
Yeah. Well, that's true of some of the policymakers. And it's also true of some of the politicians. I mean, a politician I've known very well for many years, an elected politician, has said to me very clearly, I can't possibly express in the body of Congress in which he sits my views on this issue because it's just not politically feasible for me. And I noticed in the list of signatories on this that Anthony Lewis was holding up.
You're referring to the New York Times?
The New York Times piece. Congressman Solars. Steve Solars, I talked to him when he was a member of Congress. And Solars said things he would never say on the floor of the House in a million years. And now he signs his name to some of those same views. So people do change. People feel they can't politically express things that they may believe. And then I think you're right with some policymakers. I think there's no misunderstanding at all. They know perfectly well what they're doing. On the other hand, with this administration, never assume that. I would assume ideology rather than understanding, and then possibly ill intention as well. But that's just my bias.
I would disagree that the administration is incompetent, but thank you.
Behind you a chance.
Thank you.
Last question.
Yes. Last question, I'm told, by Mr.
Yes,
Lewis.
I wonder if you would address the role of the refugees in any possible solution. Two aspects. One is the right of return, and secondly, the role that the refugees in the camps, particularly Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, would like to play in political solutions to the Palestinian state.
I think one of the great moral issues raised by the Palestine imbroglio is the moral issue of the refugees. And I think we have to be very clear on this. Many, many people who have, in some manner, form, or way, refugee status are people who are not necessarily indigent or destitute or living in camps. In fact, a large majority of people who were themselves or whose ancestors were made refugees in 1948 don't live in camps, are not indigent. Nevertheless, there is a moral issue here. And there's also a political issue for Palestinians, which is why is it that these people have failed thus far to achieve adequate representation within Palestinian politics and for their views. And I'm not sure what their views would be if they were given a range of options. I'm not sure how they would necessarily vote, depending on what they were asked to vote for. But I don't think anybody's asked them. And I think a lot of people claim to speak in their name, or a lot of people ignore what are purported to be their views without knowing what those views are. And since they were the people who in many ways suffered the most, I would argue that morally at least, they deserve to be taken into account first. What that leads to and what rights are entailed is another question. Anthony.
I'm terribly sorry to have to cut this off, but it's literally a broadcast time, and I'm under orders, and I can't. I actually had some more questions myself, so I was very self-denying. Thank you, Professor Khalidi. Your eloquence, your intelligence are. Ladies and gentlemen, I have one more thing to say, which I'm required to say. You have been listening, and this is to the broadcast audience as well, to the Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this program featuring Rhashid Khalidi, recorded in October 2006, or for information about our ongoing radio series, visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Anthony Lewis. Thank you for joining us.